pianist bets his entire jazz reputation on a funk album purists warned would end his career, and it becomes the best-selling jazz record in history. A brass-driven septet beats the Beatles for Album of the Year, then gets blackmailed by their own government into a tour that nearly destroys them. A bassist in segregation-era Georgia gets 22 colleges to cancel his tour rather than drop his own bass player. This isn't a list about songs. It's a list about the groups who didn't just play jazz. They owned the room, the charts, and the era they lived in, even when it cost them everything to get there. 10 groups, 10 eras they completely took over. I'm your host, and this is Sax Appeal, where the story behind the dominance always comes first. Let's count them down. Number 10, the modern jazz quartet, Django. 4 black musicians walked into America's biggest concert halls in the 1950s wearing tailored tuxedos, performing music that sounded more like a chamber recital than a smoky nightclub set. And it worked. John Lewis, Milt Jackson, Percy Heath, and Kenny Clarke had all cut their teeth playing bebop in Dizzy Gillespie's band, and Lewis wanted something no one else was offering: jazz treated with the same formal dignity as European classical music. For 2 decades they were, alongside Dave Brubeck, the most famous jazz act in the country, the group that got jazz into concert halls that had never let it through the front door. Jackson, the group's fiery vibraphonist, hated the restraint that dominance required. He wanted to blow the roof off every night. Lewis wanted architecture. That tension defined the band, and finally cracked it in 1974, when Jackson quit, and the group simply stopped existing. For 7 years, there was no modern jazz quartet at all. Then, in 1981, they got back together, not for money, not for nostalgia, but because, as Jackson put it, nobody else played it right. They kept reuniting until Lewis's death in 2001 finally closed the book. What they left behind wasn't a hit single. It was proof that jazz could wear a suit, sell out concert halls for 2 decades, and still swing. Number 9, the Crusaders. Put it where you want it. Before they were the Crusaders, they were teenagers at a segregated Houston high school. Saxophonist Wilton Felder, trombonist Wayne Henderson, drummer Styx Hooper, and keyboardist Joe Sample, grinding through the club circuit for years, with almost no attention from the coastal labels that decided who got famous in American music. They relocated to Los Angeles, chasing session work, and that's where the transformation happened. Rather than staying locked into strict bebop, they blended funk grooves, gospel roots, and blues phrasing into their playing, horrifying jazz purists who accused them of selling out. They dropped jazz from their name in 1971 and leaned all the way into the crossover sound. It worked completely. Their music started showing up across the industry's biggest sessions. Their tracks climbed into the pop charts, and the group became one of the most sampled acts in hip-hop decades later, their grooves outliving most of the artists who originally dismissed them. 4 Houston teenagers refused entry to the industry's front door, ended up writing the blueprint every jazz-funk crossover act would spend the next 50 years trying to copy. If stories like these are the reason you love this music, hit subscribe right now. Sax Appeal builds a new one of these every single week, and you don't want to miss what's coming next. Number 8. Snarky Puppy, Lingus. In 2004, bass student Michael League assembled 9 of his classmates into a band at the University of North Texas. Nobody thought it would last. A 10-piece instrumental group playing music too dense for jazz clubs had no obvious home. Club owners reportedly treated them like a joke walking through the door. There was no label, no manager, no radio push. Just years of driving between cities, sometimes outnumbered on stage by the size of the crowd. League has described selling 75 tickets in one city, then 98, then 140. A decade of measuring progress, one show at a time, built entirely on word of mouth and grainy YouTube clips. Then came the impossible, a Grammy nomination in late 2013, which League called a crazy moment because the growth had been so gradual he could barely believe it. They won the following year, then again in 2016, 2017, and 2021. 4 more Grammys for a band with no hit single and no major label backing. Snarky Puppy proved a devoted following, built city by city, with 0 shortcuts, could out-earn every marketing budget in the building, and dominate an entire era of modern jazz in the process. Number 7. The Dave Brubeck Quartet, Take 5. By 1958, Dave Brubeck had one of the most successful jazz groups in America, and he just added a new bassist, Eugene Wright, a black musician, joining a lineup of white players in the middle of Jim Crow America. In 1960, 22 colleges refused to let the quartet perform unless he swapped Wright out. 23 of 25 scheduled Southern shows were canceled outright, a loss worth nearly $400,000 today. Brubeck refused every single time. At one packed gymnasium, an administrator agreed to let the show go on, only if Wright stayed hidden at the back of the stage. Brubeck agreed, then handed Wright his own announcement microphone and brought him front and center for his solo. The crowd went wild. They'd integrated the venue on the spot without ever announcing they were going to. That same tour, the quartet recorded Take 5, built on an unheard-of 5-beat rhythm nobody expected to work commercially. It became the first jazz single in history to sell 1 million copies, and the parent album, Time Out, became the first jazz record ever to go platinum. Brubeck never called his stand heroic. To him, it was simply the only way the band could exist, and that band went on to define an entire decade of jazz's commercial ceiling. Number 6. Blood, Sweat and Tears, Spinning Wheel. In 1969, this brass-driven jazz rock outfit did something nobody expected. Their self-titled second album beat the Beatles' Abbey Road for Album of the Year at the Grammys, alongside 3 top 5 singles and 7 non-consecutive weeks at number 1 on the Billboard chart. For a band mixing horn section jazz arrangements with rock songwriting, it was total, era-defining dominance. Then, in 1970, the U.S. State Department asked them to tour behind the Iron Curtain as goodwill ambassadors. What the band didn't learn until decades later was the real reason they said yes. Singer David Clayton Thomas, a Canadian who'd overstayed his visa with a prior criminal record, was reportedly told he'd face deportation unless the band agreed to go. "We were blackmailed," founding member Bobby Colomby later admitted. "We had to do this, or we wouldn't have had a lead singer." The tour detonated their credibility instantly. The counterculture branded them government sellouts. A Republican congressman filed a formal complaint over their politics. Protesters threw a bag of manure onto their drummer's kit at Madison Square Garden. A band that had just out-dominated the Beatles found itself hated by both sides of the political spectrum within weeks. Clayton Thomas quit from exhaustion in 1972. The band never fully recovered its commercial peak, but for one Grammy night, they genuinely dethroned the biggest band on the planet. Number 5. Art Blakey and the Jazz Messengers, Moanin'. Art Blakey didn't just lead a band for nearly 4 decades. He ran a finishing school. He deliberately hired the most promising unknown musicians he could find, mentored them intensely for a few years, then pushed them out the door to launch their own careers. Wayne Shorter, Freddie Hubbard, Wynton Marsalis, and dozens more all passed through what musicians nicknamed the University of Blakey before becoming stars. Blakey's own story carried a darker undercurrent. He battled heroin addiction for years at the peak of his career, a struggle common among his bebop generation, navigating an industry that offered musicians fame with one hand and destruction with the other. He kept performing, kept mentoring, and kept dominating the post-bop scene even while fighting it. Most band leaders wanted to keep their best sidemen as long as possible. Blakey actively pushed his most talented players toward the exit once they were ready, understanding his legacy wouldn't be measured by one band's longevity, but by how many careers he launched. By the time he died in 1990, an entire generation of jazz's biggest names owed their start to a man who spent decades giving his own spotlight away, and in doing so, quietly controlled who got to define jazz for the next 40 years. Number 4. The Mahavishnu Orchestra, Birds of Fire. In 1971, guitarist John McLaughlin, newly renamed Mahavishnu by his spiritual guru, assembled drummer Billy Cobham, keyboardist John Hammer, violinist Jerry Goodman, and bassist Rick Laird into a band that fused Indian classical scales, jazz improvisation, and rock volume into something no one had heard. Their debut cracked the Billboard charts despite being entirely instrumental, and Birds of Fire climbed to number 15 on the Billboard 200, a genuinely dominant commercial run for an experimental fusion act. The dominance didn't last. By early 1973, keyboardist Hammer and violinist Goodman wanted more songwriting input and a bigger royalty share, and tensions escalated when McLaughlin toured with Carlos Santana, another follower of the same guru, leaving the rest of the band feeling sidelined by their own leader. Their final show came on December 30th, 1973. According to bassist Rick Laird, the 5 members didn't even say goodbye afterward. McLaughlin dissolved the group and rebuilt it with an entirely new lineup within months, a decision the original members felt erased their contribution to a sound they'd helped invent. 2 studio albums, 500 shows, and a Billboard Top 20 run later, the band that briefly owned fusion's cutting edge had burned out in under 3 years, undone by exactly the intensity that made it dominant in the first place. Number 3. Herbie Hancock and the Headhunters, Chameleon. By 1973, Herbie Hancock had already helped define fusion's outer limits, alongside Miles Davis, but his own sextet was pushing so far into abstract, ethereal territory that even Hancock admitted he was exhausted by it. Watching the Pointer Sisters connect instantly with a crowd on a shared bill, he made a decision that stunned his peers. He'd trade his experimental sextet for a stripped-down funk band, chasing grooves influenced by Sly Stone and James Brown instead of the free jazz cosmos he'd spent years building. It was, by his own admission, a massive risk. Jazz purists were furious the moment Chameleon hit the airwaves, dismissing its synthesizer bassline as a betrayal of the tradition Hancock had helped define. Black college radio thought otherwise. Howard University's station drove the record's initial explosion, and it spread from campuses outward until Headhunters went gold within months. The album became, by most counts, the best-selling jazz record ever made, peaking at number 13 on the Billboard 200, a chart position virtually unheard of for an instrumental jazz release. Decades later, its grooves became some of the most sampled material in hip-hop history, threading Hancock's fingerprints through generations of music he never set out to influence. Hancock didn't just dominate the jazz charts of 1973. He permanently rewired what a jazz record was allowed to sound like, and the entire genre followed him through the door he kicked open. Number 2. Return to Forever, Spain. Chick Corea had already played on Miles Davis's most groundbreaking fusion records when he converted to Scientology in the early 1970s, a decision guitarist Al Di Meola said gave Corea an unshakable certainty in his creative decisions. It directly inspired Return to Forever's formation in 1972, and the band's lineup shifted from a Latin jazz quintet into the blistering electric outfit that made Corea, bassist Stanley Clarke, drummer Lenny White, and Di Meola genuine arena headliners, a scale almost no acoustic jazz act of the era ever reached. The dominance came with real controversy. Song titles regularly referenced Scientology directly, and in 1993, German officials barred Corea from a concert over his church membership, serious enough that members of the U.S. Congress formally objected on his behalf. Corea disbanded the band in 1978, but he could never quite let it go. The classic lineup reunited in 1983, again for a full world tour in 2008, and once more in 2011, each reunion drawing rapturous reviews from critics who'd waited decades to hear that chemistry again. Corea died of a rare cancer on February 9, 2021, having racked up 29 Grammy nominations across a career defined by restless reinvention. Returned to Forever never got another reunion after that. The band that dominated Fusion's arena era ended exactly where its founder's story did. Number 1. Weather Report, Birdland. In 1970, keyboardist Joe Zawinul and saxophonist Wayne Shorter walked away from Miles Davis's revolutionary fusion sessions to build something entirely their own. A band with no fixed soloist and no fixed accompanist, built on continuous group improvisation instead of the traditional structure Zawinul dismissed as 8 bars, then you go to the bridge. For 16 years, Weather Report didn't just participate in the fusion era. They defined its outer edge and dared everyone else to catch up. The band's sound kept evolving, shifting from free-form abstraction into funk-driven grooves once bassist Jaco Pastorius joined in the mid-1970s. Pastorius was widely considered the most revolutionary bassist of his generation, redefining what the instrument could do inside a band this ambitious, and turning Weather Report's live shows into events other fusion acts couldn't touch. But Pastorius's brilliance came paired with a battle with bipolar disorder and addiction that grew increasingly public. On September 21, 1987, he was fatally beaten outside a nightclub in his hometown of Fort Lauderdale, Florida, following an altercation with a club bouncer. He was 35 years old. Zawinul died of skin cancer in 2007. Shorter passed in 2023. Nearly every musician who defined Weather Report's 16-year reign has now passed away, leaving behind a catalog that remains, by wide consensus, the gold standard for what an era-defining fusion band was capable of becoming. 10 groups, 10 eras they genuinely owned. Not by accident, but by taking risks their peers were too scared to take. A pianist betting his reputation on funk. A quartet integrating the segregated South mid-tour. A band beating the Beatles, then paying for it. Dominance, it turns out, was never free. That's the real lesson buried under all these liner notes. The acts that defined their era weren't the safest ones. They were the ones willing to lose everything for a sound nobody else had tried yet. And more often than not, that gamble is exactly what made them unforgettable. If one of these stories hit you harder than the rest, tell us which one in the comments below. And if you want more of the human stories hiding behind the music that dominated its era, subscribe to Sax Appeal. We'll see you in the next one.